Why Raleigh is the opposite of every U.S. city. Every American city sits on a reason you can see from space. New York has one of the deepest natural harbors on the continent. Pittsburgh sits where three rivers collide. Baltimore and Richmond sit on the fall line, that scene where boats coming upriver hit rock and have to stop. Now find Raleigh, North Carolina. No harbor, no navigable river, no mountain pass, no confluence, no crossroads. A city sitting on nothing, and that isn't a failure of siting, it's the entire point. Raleigh was put there because it had no geography, voted into existence by a legislature on a site the law defined as anywhere within 10 miles of a tavern. For a while, North Carolina barely had a capital at all. It had a government on the run. The old colonial seat was New Bern, down where the Neuse and the Trent come together near the coast. It made sense on paper. Governor William Tryon built a palace there in the 1770s, an elegant brick statement of British authority pointed straight at the water. But water works both ways. A capital you can reach by ship is a capital an enemy can reach by ship, and during the Revolution, British warships turned that convenience into a liability. A government sitting on the coast was a government within cannon range, so North Carolina's leadership did the only thing it could. It scattered. For years, the legislature met wherever it felt safe that season. 6 different towns took turns hosting the business of an entire state: Hillsborough, Halifax, Smithfield, Tarboro, Fayetteville, New Bern. Imagine trying to run a government that way. Records had to travel by wagon. Laws passed in one town had to be found again in another. And the practical result was exactly what you'd expect. Legislators stopped showing up. If the session was 300 miles of bad road away, and you weren't sure it would even be there next year, why bother? The obvious fix would have been to pick a city. North Carolina had several, real ones with wharves and warehouses and merchants and money. Wilmington had the Cape Fear River. New Bern had its palace already built. Fayetteville sat at the head of navigation on the Cape Fear, the exact kind of spot where American capitals usually end up. The delegates did the opposite. In 1788, they gathered at Hillsborough for a convention that was supposed to be about something much larger: whether North Carolina would ratify the new United States Constitution. That fight consumed the room, and in the middle of it, almost as housekeeping, the convention resolved that the unalterable seat of government should be fixed within 10 miles of Isaac Hunter's Tavern in Wake County. Read that again, because it's not a figure of speech. The legal address of a state capital was a radius drawn around a bar. There is no founding story here. There is a purchase order. In March of 1792, 9 commissioners rode out to Wake County to look at land inside that 10-mile circle. 18 landowners offered tracts. The commissioners toured them, argued, voted, and bought 1,000 acres from a planter named Colonel Joel Lane, whose farmhouse still stands today as the oldest building in the city. And why Lane's land? The official reasons were sensible enough: a healthy rise of ground, decent water, workable soil. But the story that has followed the decision for 2 centuries is less dignified. Among the practical advantages of that particular tract, over Fayetteville and everywhere else, was that there happened to be a brewery nearby. A capital chosen near a tavern, then sited near a brewery. The founding documents of most American cities read like commerce. This one reads like a bar tab. Then came the part that has no real parallel anywhere else in the country. On December 31st, 1792, the General Assembly chartered the city of Raleigh, a city with no residents, no industry, no trade, no harbor, and no economic reason whatsoever to exist. It had a name and a legal boundary before it had a single permanent inhabitant. Think about what that actually means on the ground. Somewhere out in that Piedmont forest, 1,000 acres of oaks and red clay were now, legally, a capital city. There were deer in it. There were no streets because nobody had cut them yet. The state of North Carolina owned a municipality that existed entirely on paper. Construction started, and by Bustriouai, Edersnun 1794. The State House opened for business, a plain brick building standing in a clearing. Visitors who came to see the new capital of North Carolina described it in a phrase that stuck: streets without houses. Wide avenues surveyed through the trees, lot markers driven into the dirt, a public square, and almost nothing built on any of it. A grid waiting for a city to show up. That is the whole thesis of this video, standing there in the mud in 1794. Every other American city began as people and later got a plan. Raleigh began as a plan and waited for people. The man often called the real founder of Raleigh was, at that exact moment, the fiercest opponent of the United States Constitution in the entire state. Because the political story behind the decision is real and it explains everything. His name was Willie Jones, pronounced Wiley, which is not a bad description of the man. He was a Halifax planter, the leader of North Carolina's Anti-Federalists, and the driving force behind the state's refusal to ratify the Constitution at that same 1788 Hillsborough Convention. North Carolina held out. It stayed outside the United States on its own for over a year, and Jones was a large reason why. His fear was concentrated power, held far away by people who traded and banked and never touched a plow. And he was not alone. The delegates from the Piedmont, the interior of the farm country, had spent decades watching the coastal towns run the state. The merchants were there, the shipping was there, the money was there. Every time the government sat in a port city, it sat inside a merchant's world, breathing merchant air, hearing merchant arguments. Putting the capital in the middle of nowhere solved that. Not despite the emptiness, because of it. A capital with no port has no port faction. A capital with no dominant industry has no dominant industry whispering in its ear. The location wasn't neutral, and it wasn't an accident. It was an argument about who gets to hold power in a state, written down as a map coordinate. Or that's the generous reading. The other one is a lot simpler. 9 commissioners, 18 landowners, and a whole lot of acreage that needed a buyer. Historians have been arguing about it for 200 years and still haven't settled it. So I want your verdict in the comments. Was Raleigh founded on principle, or was it a land deal wearing principle as a costume? So the state hired a surveyor to draw a city that had not been built yet. His name was William Christmas, and what he laid out in 1792 was startlingly ambitious for a place with no people in it. 254 one-acre lots. A 6-acre public square at the center for the State House, with 4 more public squares set aside in the quarters of the grid. 4 main streets, 99 feet wide, running out from the center like spokes. 17 more streets at 66 feet, 99-foot avenues, in a forest, for nobody. And then look at the names, because the names give the whole game away. In most American cities, street names are a record of what was physically there. Water Street, Front Street, Dock Street, Mill Street, Ferry Street. You can read the working life of the place right off the map. The names are fossils of commerce. Raleigh's streets are named for the government instead. Judicial districts, commissioners, governors. The map doesn't record a wharf, or a mill, or a crossing, because there wasn't one. It records the institution that willed the place into being. In a normal city, the street names tell you what people did there. In Raleigh, they tell you who signed the paperwork. And even the grid wasn't original. The design closely recycles a plan drawn back in 1758 for a colonial capital that was going to be called George City, a project of Governor Arthur Dobbs, a capital that was surveyed, named, and never built. So Raleigh's street plan is a hand-me-down from a ghost town that never existed in the first place. A borrowed blueprint for an invented city. The borrowing goes further, and it gets stranger the longer you look at it. The city is named for Sir Walter Raleigh, an English courtier, soldier, and self-promoter who never set foot in North Carolina. Not once. He financed the expeditions, he collected the credit, and he stayed home. The colony he sponsored, planted on Roanoke Island in the 1580s, is the one every American schoolchild learns about because of how it ended. The colonists vanished, leaving a word carved into a post and a mystery that has never been solved. So here is the accounting. A capital with no natural reason to exist, named for a man who never arrived, in honor of a settlement that ceased to exist 2 centuries before the city was chartered. The name commemorates an absence. There is, though, exactly one thing about the place that was genuinely native to it. and it's still the best thing about Raleigh today. When the grid went in, the plan spared the standing oaks instead of clearing them. That was unusual. New American towns in that era were typically scraped flat because trees were an obstacle and lumber was money. Raleigh kept them, and those trees are the reason the city is called the City of Oaks. Walk through the older neighborhoods now, and the canopy closes overhead in summer like a green ceiling. Even that carries a dispute. Sources disagree over whether preserving the oaks was deliberate founding-era policy or whether the nickname crystallized much later, after decades of planning. Which is fitting, honestly. In a city built entirely out of decisions, we can't quite agree on which decisions were made. The rule every other American city followed. Pull back far enough and you can see the pattern Raleigh breaks, because it's the same pattern almost everywhere else. American cities grow geography first, government second. Something about a place makes it worth stopping. A harbor deep enough for ocean ships, a river confluence where two trade routes meet, a fall line where cargo has to be hauled out of boats. People stop there because the land makes them stop. Then a few of them stay. A warehouse goes up, then a mill, then houses for the people who work the mill, then a church, then a bank, then a newspaper. Population arrives, wealth accumulates. And only after all of that does political importance show up, because by then the place is too big and too rich to ignore. The State House follows the money. The money followed the water. Geography, then people, then economy, then government. That's the sequence. Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, St. Louis, Cincinnati. Run the tape back on any of them and you find a reason the land itself provided. Raleigh ran that sequence backwards. Government first, plan second, people third, economy, eventually, sort of, if it worked out. Geography never entered the equation at all, except as a thing to avoid, which is a bold thing to do with a state capital. And the bill on it came due faster than anyone expected. The entire argument for putting the capital inland was safety. And on April 13, 1865, that argument got its test. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman had spent the previous year making a very particular point about the American South. He had burned through Georgia, taken Savannah, moved up through South Carolina, and left Columbia in ashes. Now his army was in North Carolina, moving toward Raleigh, and there was nothing meaningful between them and the capital. Remember why the site was chosen. New Bern was vulnerable because warships could reach it. Move the government 80 miles inland, past the head of navigation, and no navy on Earth can touch it. On that specific narrow point, the plan worked perfectly. No gunboat ever shelled Raleigh. Not one shot came off the water. Instead, the army walked in. Governor Vance's representatives rode out to meet Sherman and surrender the city before the fighting could start. Union troops marched up Fayetteville Street past those 99-foot avenues, and Sherman set up headquarters in the governor's palace, the executive residence of the state of North Carolina, occupied as an office by the man who had just burned his way across 3 states. And Raleigh survived largely intact. That's the part worth sitting with. Columbia burned, Atlanta burned. Raleigh got taken over a weekend and kept its buildings because there was no arsenal to destroy, no port to close, no rail hub of enormous consequence, no industrial capacity worth wrecking. The emptiness that made the site safe from the sea also made it not worth fighting over. It's a strange kind of survival, the survival of a place nobody thought was worth the ammunition. For the next century, the experiment looked like a failure. Here's the perfect illustration. In 1808, a boy named Andrew Johnson was born in a log cabin on the grounds of a Raleigh inn, the son of a porter and a laundress. He was apprenticed to a tailor as a child, ran away as a teenager, and never came back to live. He built his whole life in Tennessee. Mayor, congressman, governor, senator, and eventually President of the United States. Raleigh produced a president and couldn't hold on to him past adolescence. Whatever a young man with ambition needed, the capital of North Carolina did not have it. The problem was structural, and it went right back to the founding. A city with no port has no importers. A city with no navigable river has no mills clustered along it, no cheap freight, no reason for a factory to choose it over somewhere else. What Raleigh had was government, the legislature, the courts, the state offices. And government employs a certain number of people and then stops. The population rose and fell with the legislative calendar. Boarding houses filled when the assembly sat and emptied when it went home. For decades, Raleigh was a courthouse town that happened to be a capital. The numbers say it plainly. In 1900, Raleigh had 13,643 people, 108 years after its charter, still smaller than plenty of mill towns that nobody planned at all. By 1920, it had reached 24,418, and that growth came mostly from things arriving from outside. Electric utilities, water systems, streetcars running out to the edges of town. Infrastructure had to be installed because none of it had grown there naturally. For its first 130 years, in other words, Raleigh looked like exactly what its critics predicted in 1792, a government town on land nobody else wanted, waiting for a reason to exist that never quite arrived. And then North Carolina did the whole thing again, on purpose, at a much larger scale. By the 1950s, North Carolina had a problem it could measure. It ranked 47th out of 48 states in per capita income. The state economy rested on three legs: tobacco, textiles, and furniture. All three were labor-heavy, low-wage, and increasingly exposed to competition. Worse, the state was educating people and then exporting them. Duke, the University of North Carolina, and North Carolina State were producing serious graduates every single year, and those graduates were leaving because the jobs waiting for them were in New York and Chicago and California. North Carolina was running a talent pipeline for other states, so its leaders reached for the only playbook the state had ever known. If you don't have the thing you need, you draw it on a map and build it. In January of 1959, with roughly $2 million raised privately, a group of businessmen, university officials, and the governor's office founded Research Triangle Park on former tobacco farmland in the empty space between the three universities. It was planned, mapped, zoned, and named before it had a single tenant. Thousands of acres of pine woods and worn-out fields laid out for laboratories that did not exist yet, for companies that had not agreed to come. Researchers who study the place describe it in almost exactly the words you'd use to describe Raleigh itself: a centrally planned rather than an organic process. A grid drawn on emptiness, waiting for people to show up. For the first few years, it looked like 1794 all over again. The roads were in. The tenants were not. The pitch was a peculiar one. Come to a pine forest in a poor southern state and we'll build your research campus. There were serious people who thought the whole thing was a boondoggle, an expensive gesture from a state that couldn't afford gestures. But the punchline is that it worked, and it worked at a scale nobody in that room in 1959 seriously expected. Research Triangle Park now spans nearly 7,000 acres. That is roughly a third the size of Manhattan, given over to research campuses, and it hosts around 200 companies and tens of thousands of jobs. IBM came. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences came. Pharmaceutical companies came, then software, then biotech. The graduates stopped leaving, and the metro around it, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, turned into one of the most consistently fast-growing regions in the United States, regularly ranked among the best American cities for business. Now compare that to how the other great American tech clusters happened. Silicon Valley emerged out of Stanford, defense contracts, a garage or two, and a long string of accidents that nobody could have scheduled. Route 128 outside Boston grew the same way, organically, around MIT and Harvard and the money that pooled near them. Nobody drew those places first. They accumulated. The triangle was drafted. Scholars still argue about what that means. Is Research Triangle Park a replicable model, a thing any state could do with enough coordination and patience? Or was it a one-time product of Sputnik-era federal research money, cheap land, a compliant political culture, and three major universities that happened to sit within 30 miles of each other? Dozens of regions have tried to copy it. Most of the copies did not take, which leaves the biggest question in this story genuinely open. Nobody has settled whether Raleigh's trick can be repeated or whether North Carolina simply got lucky twice with the same unlikely idea. Every rule that American cities follow, Raleigh runs backwards. Government before geography, plan before people, charter before residents, an economy engineered before it was ever earned. There's no harbor in the founding story, no river bend, no ford, no trading post that grew. Just a legislature, a 10-mile radius drawn around a tavern, a surveyor's grid borrowed from a capital that never got built, and a name honoring a man who never came. By every historical rule about how cities work, Raleigh should have stayed a sleepy courthouse town, the kind of place that hosts a legislature for a few weeks a year and then goes quiet, slowly losing ground to the ports and the mill towns and the places the land actually favored. For 130 years, that's exactly what it was. Instead, it is one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, anchoring a research economy that states with real harbors have spent decades trying and failing to reproduce. So the next time you look at a map and try to explain why a city is where it is, remember that one of them has no explanation at all, because the answer isn't in the land. It's in a decision. A place built on nothing beat places built on rivers, and it did it twice. If you want to keep going, there's another one on screen right now, and subscribe if you'd like more of these.